to be a global leader in the world.
I think one of the biggest achievements for us is that we have developed into a multi-product, multi-market, and a multi-customer company, which means that we are not just developing vaccines and therapeutics in one product, as one product or in one country, but it's available for the entire world.
The mandate that typically we had when we joined this company was to work on new vaccines. And it kind of pretty much simplifies what BARPATEC stands for, lead innovation. And the mandate that we have is that we lead and not follow the pipeline of other companies, particularly the MNCs. And to this effect, we've taken strong initiatives supported and encouraged by the management. And a couple of examples that I want to talk about is the chikungunya vaccine and the Zika vaccine. And we were the early movers in this vaccine field, and we developed new vaccines much ahead of others.
At Bharat Forge Limited, we don't believe in pause buttons. 50 years ago, we hit play, and we haven't stopped since. We move, we go places, and we take our legacy with us. We started small, but our dreams were big. And we chased them tirelessly with all our heart. That's what brought us to the top, to the world's biggest names, and to people's lives. We're committed to partnering greatness, no matter where we go. From India to Germany, to France to Sweden, and now USA. We always go that extra mile and bring the best to wherever our clients are, and we never settle. Over 50 years, we have pioneered innovations across fields. Our expertise keeps sharpening. Our credits keep increasing. And our relationships, they only keep growing. We are fueled by our dreams, inspired by the next possibility. We nurture ideas, give them wings, make them soar. We seek to build a better, smarter, and brighter tomorrow. And we will. Because that's just who we are. Driven, caring, innovative, and unstoppable.
Imagine a world with health for all and hunger for none. At Bayer, we are transforming this dream into reality. By harnessing the power of science for better, we believe in nourishing the planet while ensuring food security. Because better is empowering farmers to sustainably increase incomes while promoting gender-smart ecosystems. We are pioneering specialized medicines and life-saving therapies for critical diseases. Because better is advancing solutions for a healthier future. To live a fuller life, we need to transform our everyday health. Better is when people are equipped with the right knowledge and resources to lead the best possible life. Better is not what we do, but why we do it. Together, let's create a world that is better for all. Bayer, science for better.
India, the fastest growing major economy, setting development milestones in 25 years of Amrit Kaal. The third largest economy by 2028, a developed nation by 2047.
आजादी के अमृत काल में जब देश आजादी के 100 साल मनाएगा, उस समय दुनिया में भारत का तिरंगा झंडा, विकसित भारत का तिरंगा झंडा होना चाहिए.
Realizing the goal of a developed nation requires world-class infrastructure and logistics ecosystem to support business requirements, besides creating employment and robust health and education systems. Thus, infrastructure connectivity becomes a primary facilitator for socio-economic growth. Led by our visionary Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi, this year's Union Budget has announced a historic capex push of $121 billion to be invested in infrastructure to facilitate multimodal connectivity across the nation, connecting hinterland manufacturers to EXIM gateways, facilitating seamless movement of goods and people, and addressing last-mile connectivity gaps. With these objectives at the core, the Government of India launched the PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan in October 2021 and introduced a transformational approach to integrated planning of multimodal infrastructure in the country.
बदलता हुआ भारत आज पुरानी चुनौतियों को समाप्त करते हुए आगे बढ़ रहा है. हम समस्याओं के स्थायी समाधान पर, परमानेंट सॉल्यूशन पर जोर दे रहे हैं. और इसका एक उदाहरण पीएम गति शक्ति नेशनल मास्टर प्लान भी है.
Indigenously developed under Atmanirbhar Bharat and Digital India, the PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan is a GIS-enabled platform that adopts geospatial and other cutting-edge technologies and integrates multiple data layers of infrastructure on a single portal. This brings various ministries and departments together and enables comprehensive and database planning for the country's development. A three-tier institutional system facilitates seamless coordination between line ministries and departments, states and union territories, and local-level organizations, keeping up the spirit of cooperative federalism. This whole-of-government approach has resulted in the timely planning of projects in a cost-efficient manner, reducing overlaps with existing infrastructure, minimizing ecological impact, and reducing delays due to interdepartmental clearances. By improving the country's logistics efficiency in this manner, the PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan has the potential to save billions of dollars annually, which can be utilized for public welfare schemes and various infrastructure projects. The PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan has a positive impact, and some of the examples are: regular NPG meetings are facilitating fast-track clearances from different authorities and de-risking investments. Sanction of 400+ final location surveys by Ministry of Railways is an 8-fold jump from the previous year of manual surveys. Today, the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas completes detailed route survey within a day's time, as compared to 6 to 9 months taken previously. Forest area intersection on the Pune-Bengaluru Expressway has been reduced by 19%. More than $20 million have been saved in the alignment of Silchar-Jiribhum-Impal gas pipeline, planned as part of the Northeast gas grid. The variety and scale of PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan impacted disaster management planning in Goa, efficient coastal corridor planning in Gujarat's western coast, objective decision-making for locating new schools in Uttar Pradesh, efficient movement plan for carrying freight by coastal shipping, 4G coverage to 30,000 villages in the country. PM Gati Shakti area development approach is revolutionizing India's planning for connectivity to both economic and social centers, thereby leading to balanced and sustainable socio-economic growth, and thus realizing our Prime Minister's goal of a developed nation by 2047. The enduring outcomes of the PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan are benefiting all stakeholders and citizens of the country. Reduced logistics costs are rendering the manufacturing sector more competitive, while fostering resilient supply chains and enhancing integration with global value chains, thus upholding India's spirit of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The world is one family.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I request you all to please take your seats. May I also remind you to kindly keep your mobile phones in the silent mode. Please be seated. As we start this morning's program, I would also like to remind you that we have an exhibition that has been arranged outside on the lawns, the PM Gati Shakti exhibition, which is open, and we invite you to take a tour of this sometime today or tomorrow. Please make time to do this because we have a wonderful exhibition arranged for you outside on the lawns. Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second day of the B20 Summit. Established in 2010, B20 is among the most prominent engagement groups of the G20, representing the priorities of businesses globally. Over the years, the B20 has gained more strength and visibility. Yesterday, we had 6 plenaries on different priorities, and now at the 7th plenary session, we look at financing the climate transition. I'd like to now invite all our panelists up to take their seats on the dais. Mr. Bernard Looney, the Chief Executive Officer of BP, the UK. Mr. Uday Kotak, the Chief Executive Officer of Kotak Mahindra Bank, India. Mr. Mark Tucker, the Group Chairman of HSBC Holdings, the UK. Mr. Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and the co-chair of GFANZ and chair and head of Transition Investing, Brookfield Asset Management. Ms. Verena Lim, Chief Executive Officer, Asia, and member Global Management Committee, Macquarie Group, Singapore. Mr. T.V. Narendran, the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director, Tata Steel. And to steer the discussion, may I invite Ms. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, CEO, E.L. Rothschild, and founder and co-chair of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. It's over to Lynn to steer this session.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be back in India. I've had years of doing business here and really am enjoying seeing so many friends, and also to be part of something that's so important. The Be India team has done an amazing job in providing the G20 with important input into their deliberations later this year. India is a great nation. You're not only the largest democracy in the world, but you've provided so much to the world, and your leadership is just beginning again and again. And so thank you for hosting us. And my deepest thanks to this amazing panel of both industry and finance to take on this very important question about financing the climate transition. We need to think of it both as an obligation and also as an opportunity. And I think that's what we will flesh out today on this panel. We have to create a vital and effective partnership between the public and private markets if we're going to solve the climate problem. There's no option. The strongest force in the world is the private market, and we need to make it work. And we need to make it work for all of the constituencies. And just briefly, as context, I think we need to define the problem. It's really not just about greenhouse gases. It's not just about 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. It's also about how the transition affects people, how it affects the price of energy, how it affects our national security, how it affects workers. And this, I've often felt that the environmental movement missed the people part of it. And I'm very grateful to the two gentlemen on either side of me, Bernard Looney and Mark Carney, because they joined with me the Council for Inclusive Capitalism that was inaugurated by Pope Francis in 2019. And the inspiration from the Pope came from the Laudato Si when he talked about the climate and that we had to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And I think we always have to keep that framing in mind when we think about the problem. We have done work at the Council to create a just energy transition framework, and the conversation needs to be along those lines. We also have to think about the scale of the problem. I mean, we have been on this planet for 300,000 years, and somehow we've just managed to screw it up in the last 60 years. And so it's our obligation to fix it. According to the World Economic Forum, 44% of global economic activity is somehow dependent on nature. And 1.2 billion, or 40% of global jobs, are dependent upon climate. So the scale is enormous. But unfortunately, to fix it is going to cost a lot of money. Bloomberg says it's going to be $200 trillion, or $7 trillion a year. Uday said that it's going to be 4.5 trillion a year through 2030. Unfortunately, from 2011 till 2020, between public and private finance, there's been about 4.8 trillion toward this problem. So we really have to up our game. And the good news is that by doing it, we will be creating opportunities. There's the World Economic Forum says there are 365 million jobs that will be created by transferring our economy to a clean economy, and that'll add $10 trillion a year in economic growth. But there's no better group to delve into how we're going to get it done than this group, which has already been introduced to you. And on that note, I want to turn to Mark Carney with the first question. There's very few people on the planet who we can thank more than Mark Carney for the progress that we've made toward climate change. He's too modest to want me to say too much more, but we should all be incredibly grateful to the role that Mark Carney played, both in his role as governor of the Bank of England and before and after that. So Mark, why don't you frame for us how governments and public finance industry can work better and more effectively with the private sector?
Thank you very much, Lynn. Let me thank our B20 chair, Chandra, and the whole organizing team for this extraordinary event and all the work that's gone into it, the substance behind it, and the impact that this is going to have on the G20. Because as you've just put on the table, and Uday did yesterday with the numbers, and I'd be more on the 7 trillion end of the spectrum. It is absolutely an enormous amount of capital that has to go everywhere. We're not going to solve this problem anywhere unless we solve it everywhere. And I'm going to zero in really on the emerging and developing world and what governments and the multilateral banks need to do to address the developing world. And the first point I want to make is that we've really been caught in a situation where individual institutions have been acting rationally but collectively foolishly. So the major development banks, the World Banks and others, have been very carefully managing their capital, good stewards of that capital, and as a consequence of that, feeding the problem. And what needs to happen, and I think the Indian G20 presidency has started this process with the work of N.K. Singh and Larry Summers and others, is to change the orientation of these organizations. And the orientation has to be, what is our contribution to helping to get to that 7 trillion per year number in the emerging and developing world? So it's not how much lending we do as, let's say, the World Bank, but what's the total capital that we're catalyzing with our activities? So the core objective has to be focused in that way. And there's really 3 ways, and I'll just outline them quickly and then hand back, that they can do that. And the first is to use their balance sheets much more effectively, to take on the risk that the private sector can't take on. And that is through mechanisms such as guarantees, it's through subordination, so taking first loss, and it's through recycling the balance sheet. If you make a good loan, if you help to prepare a project, then hand it on to somebody else who can see it to the full conclusion and take that capital back. And this is the work that Ajay Banga and others are involved in at the World Bank. So first, use your balance sheet more effectively. The second is really to focus in on transition finance. And it goes back to the work that you led and Bernard's leading on a just transition. We all understand clean energy, but the biggest challenges are in the hard-to-abate sectors, the existing energy system, the workers and the communities that are affected by those. And we need to get capital to all aspects. And the international institutions cannot just provide some of that capital to help phase out, for example, a thermal coal activity in a responsible period of time, but to help retrain those workers and, very importantly, to allow private capital to come in alongside, because let's face it, there is a reputational risk to have exposure to those. And then the last thing I'd say is that I think the governments and the multilateral institutions through this G20 and at COP28 has to grasp the nettle around some of the key markets, and I'll point to one, which is the market for voluntary carbon offsets, sometimes called carbon credits. In effect, if we do this right, the world does this right, we will have transfers from some of the largest, best capitalized financial institutions and companies in the world to projects in the emerging and developing world, transfers on the orders of magnitude of $150 billion to $200 billion a year if we get this right. Now, that is not a get-out-of-jail card for those companies. Those companies are going to work to get their emissions down, but it does mean that we can catalyze action. My point is that the governments and the international financial institutions can help set the rules and govern those markets so that those transfers really are having the impact on the ground.
Just to follow up, that's such an important point. Do you believe that there can be a voluntary carbon market that is not regulated by governments, or do you challenge governments to regulate?
Well, so what we've had to do is to put in place the standards on what's called supply integrity. So you know that the nature-based solution is happening, or you know that the coal plant is being phased out and the renewable plant's being put in place, and you get that. Those rules have been developed through something called the ICBCM, and John Kerry and others are working in parallel with that. And then you have to determine who can buy those credits. And in effect, the ability to buy those credits is, are you trying to get your own emissions down? And if you're trying to do that, and there are standards that have been developed for that as well. And so what we need now from governments is to say, these are the right standards, and then transparency to track both sides of the supply and the demand side, and actually what's being put in place are mechanisms so that all stakeholders can. So we're ready for this to happen. We need the hand of government and authorities to say, okay, we sanction this and move forward.
So we need government for both finance and regulation. So let me turn to Bernard Looney, who you're right in the middle of it, of taking incredibly important actions to move BP beyond petroleum, as you said many, many years ago. But also, you are well aware that the transition needs to be not only rapid, but also orderly. And perhaps you could describe to us from your point of view as an industry leader what that transition looks like.
Well, thank you, Len. Let me add my thanks, as Mark did, to Chandra and the team. Superb, fantastic to be here in India. India is the future. If you don't know that, you certainly feel it when you hit the ground. So great to be here in India with you all. And Len, thank you for your leadership, because if Mark is to be thanked, so are you. What you've done with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism is extraordinary in bringing us together and bringing about real change. And I just want to personally acknowledge you for what you're doing and continue to do. And it's great to work with you. A rapid and an orderly transition. What does that mean? I think in many ways the case for a rapid transition is relatively straightforward. Emissions have risen every year since Paris, with the exception of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, emissions fell by 5.6% when the world essentially ground to a halt. So that is not a strategy that we wish to employ. But the reality is that emissions are continuing to rise, and therefore, with each day that is happening, the urgency around the pace and the speed of the transition simply grows. So in many ways, the case for the rapid transition is relatively straightforward. The case for the orderly transition, I think, is something that we need to spend a little bit more time talking about. Now, an orderly transition is one where today's energy system needs continued investment. And today's energy system, some people don't like this fact, but it is a fact. It's 55% oil and gas. It was 57% in 2012. And it needs continued investment. Why? We need to make sure that we continue to match supply with demand. Why is this important of today's energy system? It's important because of the following. Last year, the world lost 3% of the world's gas supply. Demand didn't change because nothing was done to change demand, but supply was lost, 3%. Prices went up sevenfold. Not 7%, not 70%, 700%. Now, what happened when gas prices rose sevenfold? Two things happened. The first is that countries, to fuel their economies, turned to the next cheapest alternative, which is what? Coal. Coal usage reached a record. German coal consumption went up 25%. South Korea's coal consumption went up. Japan's coal consumption went up. I think coal consumption went up here the same in China. That's not what we're trying to achieve with the transition. So that's the first thing that happens when we don't match supply and demand. And the second thing that happens is that typically in an OECD economy, between 10 and 12% of the GDP is spent on energy. Last year, that number went to 20%. 20% of GDP being spent on energy. That is not sustainable economically, nor does it leave any room to invest the necessary dollars into the transition. So we need a rapid transition, but we also need to make sure that the transition is orderly, that the transition is just. If it's not just, there won't be a transition. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that in our language at BP in what we call a very simple strategy description, which is and, not, or. We must invest like crazy, you would argue, in accelerating the energy transition, period. And, not or, we must at the same time continue to invest responsibly in today's energy system, which is a hydrocarbon system. It is an and strategy, not an or strategy. And we're doing that here in India. We're investing with our great partners, Reliance, in offshore natural gas here. We've just brought on a field recently, and we're now producing, I believe, 1/3 of India's domestic gas production here in India. And, not or, at the same time, we're, through our GeoBP retail network, rolling out EV charging points as fast as we can. Sashi, who runs our business here, told me that when I was here in January, we had 750 charge points. Today, we have 3,000 charge points. We've just completed 300,000 battery swaps for 2- and 3-wheelers. These are not in contradiction. This is an and, not or strategy, because India wants to be net zero by 2070. It also wants to have energy independence by 2047, and it has every right to want both of those things. So, Len, that's what we're trying to do. That's why this conversation is so important, because if ever we focus on just one aspect of the equation, I worry that we won't achieve the goal that we all want.
We have to work with the people who are giving us energy and help that transition. It's very important. Verena, I'd like to turn to you, if I may, because you are such an important source of private capital in the renewable industry. So how do you see that working, and what is the future, particularly toward that enormous number that's needed?
Thanks, Lynn. And I'd like to also thank the chair of B20 and the organisers for bringing this panel together. I think Macquarie has had the opportunity to work with some of our fellow panelists and the organisations they represent on climate transition initiatives. So we've actually seen the commitment firsthand, which is really great. So over the last 2 decades, Macquarie has really worked with governments and our clients to really support energy transition initiatives and really try and find practical solutions to climate challenges. We're continuing to leverage really our deep expertise in infrastructure, in energy, in commodities to help companies meet renewable energy targets, to strengthen infrastructure resilience, and also support decarbonisation initiatives. If you look at our client base, many of them are, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, insurance company, amongst others. But what is common about them is that, I describe them as patient capital. So they do have the ability to look at things long term, which means they should be well suited to invest in transition, which will take longer. And if I look at this space, there has been a real dramatic increase in investments coming into this space from this group. So if you look at it globally, I think there's been more than $90 billion of capital flooding into decarbonisation investment funds over the last 2 years. And so whilst global investments we know need to triple, I think, for the rest of the 2020s, we believe there is no shortage of investor appetite or investor interest in this space. So the question is really converting that interest into something tangible in terms of deployment. So there are many ways I think private capital can accelerate the deployment in this area. But in the interest of time, Lynn, I'll probably just focus on 3 areas. The first one being, I think private capital needs to accelerate its deployment in mature technologies such as solar and wind, to really, this sounds really obvious, but to provide communities with clean and low-cost electricity. So based on our experience in, say, markets like Taiwan and Korea, particularly in the offshore wind space, we've really seen the benefits when governments set clear ambitions through national targets, which are then backed by strong and sustained policy commitments. Now, of course, barriers like permitting challenges or supply chain challenges do remain, but it's really that government commitment that's really vital. Secondly, I would say just investing in mature renewables or technology alone is not enough. So private capital really needs to support its investments or, commercialize emerging technology. And that's going to require a significant amount of capital across infrastructure investments. And based on our initial commitment into this space, we've actually seen it work really well when there is that strong partnership between communities, developers, off-takers, policymakers, and financiers. So we really need to, work out how we do that better. We've also recognized that you do need a different mindset when it comes to scaling in this area. So the one thing that we do, which is a bit more within our control, is work out whether we have the right sources of capital to play in this space, because we do recognize that, even at the investment committee level, looking at the risk return profiles of these investments may not be the way we should be looking at it traditionally. And then finally, I would say we've started to see more carbon intensive assets really struggling to secure, affordable insurance. It's obviously really difficult to finance or even refinance. And, when we look at how do we exit these investments, the reality is there is a constraint in terms of future buyers. But what we've also seen is if by engaging these existing assets on a net zero pathway, it's given us a bit more clarity on, what the investment future is for these existing assets, and also actually produce secondary product streams and services. So I guess hopefully that's given you a bit of sense of some of the opportunities and challenges we're seeing.
Yeah, I'm interested just in a follow-up on the direction that you are seeing from the asset owners, from the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, your investors, toward investment in renewables over the last 3 years. Have you found that there has been a greater reluctance in recent years to fund renewables because the returns have not kept up with many of the non, or do you still have investors? And I see Mark Carney wants to get into this question. You know where I'm headed. So where are the asset owners when they get into their investment committees actually on this question?
Yeah.
And I know I'm
Wanna
going to
go
turn to
first,
Mark because he's
Okay,
really anxious to answer this. No, Verena, you answer first.
Okay, so it's a good question, and I don't think I can speak on behalf of every single sovereign wealth fund or pension fund, so it is a little bit case by case. There are more questions about risk returns on renewable assets because they're obviously, at the end of the day, they're looking at their portfolio and wondering whether the investment actually makes sense. But we are still, I think, the overall interest in this thematic and the buy-in into needing to actually invest is still there. But I have to say, it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction and the type of investments we're making, it does differ a little bit.
I'll give a very quick answer, if I may. Just we see overwhelming interest in this from a Brookfield perspective. We raised a $15 billion transition fund. We closed it 14 months ago. That's entirely deployed. We'll see where the returns are, but they will be very attractive returns. We're back in the market raising again. We have a $80 billion backlog around this, and to go to something that Verena rightly emphasized is where there are huge opportunities here, absolutely huge, and literally huge opportunities in India, as this group knows and is living. But as you rightly emphasized, where there are significant opportunities, if you can go to those places where there's transition, pick up on something that Bernard was saying earlier, and you're part of the end. So you're moving across, it can be an industrial company, it can be an existing generator that has a mix of generation, and then you're getting in and being part of the solution. So I would say what we're seeing in terms of investment dollars being put out and interest in it is a wall of money. I mean, it is a wall of money. Now, it needs to be a wall of money because we've gone from 500 billion in clean energy investment 7 years ago to 1.2 last year, 1.7 this year, but it needs to go up to 4. So it needs to keep going. And that's the context.
So you see that happening, even though it hasn't happened over the last 10 years. But
No, Lynn, it's gone from 500 billion to 1.7 trillion. That is happening. That is a trip. That is bigger than the investment in conventional energy now. Now, Bernard would say that there needs to be a bit more investment in conventional. At least we need to maintain it in order to keep that there. But now, globally, the investment in clean energy solutions is a bigger market than the investment in conventional energy. So that has happened. I don't recognize at all the idea that it hasn't happened.
4.5 trillion isn't 1.7 trillion, but
4.5 is the number by the end of the decade. 4.5 is the number by the end of the decade, not now. The IEA number right now is 1.5 trillion, is where the run rate should be. The point is, it's where it's got to go, but it's already tripled over the course of the last 7 years.
Okay. So why don't we turn to another industry player, Narendran? You are present in both the global north and the global south. So you're dealing with the enormous end of the problem, which maybe the carbon credit market can help address. But can you tell us how you see the transition working in the global north and the global south from your point of view? You have a hard to abate industry indeed.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, steel accounts for 8% of the carbon footprint in the world today, and steel is growing, particularly in emerging markets. I think the transition has started to happen, but it can happen only if, firstly, there's a policy framework to support the transition. There should be carbon markets, which there are in Europe. There is this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is being debated. There needs to also be infrastructure support because steel depends a lot on coal. Coal is used as a reductant, not just as an energy source. So coal supply chains have been built over 100 years. So we saw, the importance of supply chains even when the recent disruptions happened. Even for gas, the supply chains are only about 40, 50 years old. So transitioning from coal to gas to hydrogen, even from a supply chain point of view, is a very complex challenge. The scale is very significant, so it's not about getting small amounts of gas or hydrogen across. If you want to electrify process industry, you also need to make it easier for electricity to move easily across countries and across continents. So I think the cost and complexity of this journey is going to be significant, and we should not underestimate that. The industry can support part of the cost, but the cash flows of the industry in mature markets cannot underwrite the cost of transition. So you need government support. You also need customers to be willing to pay more for green products. So I think all this needs to converge for the industry to transition and have a sustainable business, not only from an environment point of view, but also from a financial point of view. So it's a long journey. I think the journey is started in Europe and in the US with the IRA. In India also, we've set some very aggressive targets for renewables as part of our grid. But a lot more needs to be done because a lot of the increasing steel capacity in the world is going to come up in India, and we need to transition into a greener process route sooner.
So Uday, as CEO of one of the largest financial institutions and one of the fastest growing economies in the world, dealing with this, how would you feel you're placed to make this investment that Narendran and Bernard and others need to actually solve the problem?
Lynn, I think we are basically dealing with two counter forces. First is a race with reference to the existing and existential viability of planet Earth. And the second is the economic viability of the business model of planet Earth. For existential viability versus economic viability of the business model of the planet Earth. And I think we have to be clear that the risk of existential viability of planet Earth has to be put a step above the business viability of planet Earth. And therefore, while a lot of focus is on transition financing, which I think is important, but do we have the time to play for the economic viability to work out versus the existential viability? And it is here that I think we have certainly no choice to go beyond capital which expects returns to capital which is gap and ready to take the losses. And where is that loss-bearing capital going to come from the planet? It has to come from businesses around the planet which are making economic profits today for existential viability of the planet. And if we look at this equation and prioritize existence over economic viability, there has to be first money from business. And I agree with what Narendran said and what Mark as well said. It has to be a partnership with government. Government has to provide those loss-bearing guarantees in addition to private capital. And therefore, the model which I believe the world needs to move to is gap funding provided by governments and supplemented by some of the current economic profits from business worldwide. And add these two and hand it over to appropriate institutions, including a multilateral institution, to be able to leverage this capital at 7, 8, 10 times. So you create a large enough pool of global capital which can go and fund on a priority businesses on gap. And how do we do that gap funding is going to be critical. We cannot expect private businesses to do the loss-bearing funding for a project unless there is gap capital coming separately. And this is the change which I think we need to make in mindset, and a sense of urgency and paranoia, which currently seems to be that we will transition our way. An existential issue of the planet is going to be after economic viability is protected. I don't think that's the time we have.
Okay, Mark. So you're a global bank doing a lot in Asia. What is your perspective on this conversation about how to turbocharge the private markets to invest in the transition?
Lynn, thank you. And again, as my colleagues have said, I think a thanks to Chandra and the team for organizing all of this and organizing it so effectively and efficiently. Let me take this from two perspectives, two areas. The first is how we think about working with clients, and the second is just the need for financial innovation. But before doing that, again, let me come back and just set a context. We set out an ambition 2 years ago to provide sustainable financing and investment of up to $1 trillion US. This is just HSBC by 2030. As of June 23, as of last month, we've already committed and invested $255 billion US in this process. So small in the numbers that Mark gave earlier, but I think indication of how serious and how committed certainly one global bank is. I mean, I think the biggest impact when we come back to our customers, and I have one sitting next to me on my left, so I think it's very appropriate. But I think what is most important is we can be most effective by helping our customers through a transition journey. We shouldn't try to avoid that, and I think just given the mix of portfolio we have, particularly across the oil and gas side, both in sector and in geography, Asia and in the Middle East, again, we probably have one of the greatest exposures to this, but also one of the greatest opportunities. I think when we're not in a situation, we've committed to our customers, we can't walk away from our customers. We can't leave effectively people looking for shadow banking, the shadow finance sector to be able to provide this. We have to step up and take accountability and responsibility. And that means working closely with our customers, looking at their business plans, looking at what they want to do in the future, looking at how they are going to transition and working with them very closely to the process. That is how we can be most powerful in ensuring this is done. There are majority of customers are willing and have accepted and are excited about the journey, and certainly BP is high on that list. Many others, I think we still are encouraging through the process and the journey. And again, there will be some that just won't accept this is the journey to go on, and we won't work with them in the future. So I think it's that level of sort of commitment and determination that we have. On the need for financial innovation, I mean, there's a huge amount of creative thinking going into crowding in finance, sustainable finance through innovative products and systems. Again, a huge amount going on. I think as Mark and Uday have said, I think utilizing government support and development bank support to particularly de-risk the opening stages of projects is critical. And we've worked two major projects, one with the Asian Development Bank and the Energy Transition Mechanism, really just to speed up the basis of coal-fired power stations while also investing in green finance. And we've, working across our portfolios, Indonesia has been one of the key areas of focus here. And we've also been working on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which again is helping move some of the emerging markets from coal production to out of coal production effectively. And here we've been working with Vietnam, with Indonesia, and with South Africa. So again, that's sort of the old economy. On the new economy, there's got to be significant finance put into sustainable aviation, shipping fuel, green hydrogen. All of these different elements have different technical aspects, different business plans, and we've got to be able to adapt our business to be able to work with these models of the future. But I think hopefully that gives you some sense of how significant and seriously we're taking this.
That's so interesting and so important. Particularly that idea that you need to work with your clients. Just like we need to have energy, we need to have steel. And somehow part of this $7.5 trillion, it can't be good money is over here. You're the virtuous investors here, and you're the diabolical investors if you're someplace else. And so, and Bernard, you're really at the receiving end of that. We know what you're doing for the transition. HSBC knows. Anyone involved with you knows the sincerity of it. But how would you talk to those people who say, we have 7.5 trillion for windmills and electric cars, and we're not going to give you any of that money? What is the role of oil and gas? And maybe you have a view on steel as well.
Great. Well, I'll stick to what I know a little bit at least. But I mean, how would I make that argument? I mean, I'd quote Mark Carney, if that's okay. And Mark, I learned a lot from him. But one of the things that I learned that he said very, very early on, which speaks to what Mark Tucker just said, which is if we're going to solve climate, We have to go where the emissions are. Everybody's trying to run away from the emissions. Everybody wants to, as you say, build a solar plant or a wind plant or whatever. And that's great, and we need that. But let me tell you, that is not going to help the world get to net zero in the way that we need to. We are not going to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors like shipping, like steel, like cement, like aviation with a solar farm. We need to actually go to those industries and work with them. We have to go to where the emissions are and work with those industries. Mark, coming and working with BP, knowing that we have an objective and an ambition to transition, but knowing that we're an oil and gas company predominantly today. But that takes courage in today's world. But that's the courage that we need, because we simply are not going to solve this problem by simply trying to build just solar or wind plants. And by the way, we're doing that at BP. But we have to work with the hard-to-abate sectors, and in some people's language, that means we have to get our hands dirty and actually work with these industries and help them decarbonize. So that's the first thing that I would say. And secondly, around the role of oil and gas companies, you know, the best way, Lynn, maybe is through an example. If you and I wanted to start up a company tomorrow to supply sustainable aviation fuel that Mark the only way we're going to have any impact on aviation in the next 10, 20 years is through sustainable aviation fuel. Let's say you and I want to start a company to do that. We're going to have to do three things. Number one, we're going to have to source feedstock. Number two, we're going to have to build a plant. And number three, we're going to have to sell it. Now, here at BP, which many people would say is an oil and gas company, what would they have as a role in this new world? Let us just assess how we would do that. Feedstock, the hardest thing you and I would have to do. I am fortunate. Our company has been one of the largest commodity traders in the world for many, many decades. We've just done a deal with a company called New Seed. They grow a crop called Carinata. It's a non-food crop. It's a cover crop. We've done a 10-year supply deal with that. That would be very hard for Len and I to do as a startup. We've done that. Secondly, we have to build a plant. Well, guess what? We spent decades building plants. We brought on 34 projects over the last 7 or 8 years around the world. And not alone have we a track record in doing that, we'll build it next to our refinery at BP. And the utilities are there and the power is there, so BP will build it probably 30% cheaper than Len or I can as a startup. And then the final thing is we have to sell that product. And Len and I will go on Google looking for the chief executive of Air India. I'm sure Chandra would point us in the right direction. But at BP, we have Air BP. We're in 700 airports worldwide. We're in 60 countries worldwide. We have decade-long relationships with every aviation carrier in the world. You look at that ecosystem and you say, why wouldn't we be doing sustainable aviation fuel? We're the natural person to do it. If we want to start up an EV charging infrastructure company tomorrow, the biggest issue we will have is access to land. 550 million people live within 20 minutes of a BP site. Why wouldn't we use that enormous incumbent advantage to take on the transition? So we see the transition as a massive opportunity for our company, not a threat to our business. We see it as a massive growth opportunity. But the reality is we have to do what Mark Carney said. We have to go where the emissions are. We have to work with energy-intensive sectors and help them on their very challenging and difficult, worthwhile though, journey to decarbonize. That's what we're trying to do. We spent 3% of our capital outside of oil and gas in 2019. 3 years later, that number is 30%, and we're on our way to 40% and 50% of our capital going into the transition by the end of the decade. But we can't do it alone. We need Mark Tucker helping us with financing, which he is doing. He's got his constituents. We have to help him make sure that he understands what we're trying to do. It's challenging, it's worthwhile, and it's full of opportunity.
So that... Good job. So that takes me to Mark Carney and Verena to tell us, are you willing to go into the problem? Should governments be in the problem more than they are? And should the private money come in to support these colossal private efforts? And later this afternoon, we're going to be talking, by the way, about how you measure what Bernard is promising to do in the transition, which is a sidebar to this financing question, but it's important.
I mean, the short answer, I wouldn't put it in the future. We are doing that. That's exactly what we're doing. I referenced something Brookfield's doing, this $15 billion fund. That fund takes out the emissions of New York City, London, and Toronto combined, okay? 15 billion deployed in 1 year. And the reason it does is, yes, there is greenfield renewable, but it goes to where the emissions are, and I'll credit you with that. And for example, buying the largest utility in Australia, which has thermal generation, 7% of Australia's emissions is one company. We're buying it with partners, it is subject to regulatory approval. And instead of taking a dividend, it's been paying out most of its cash flow as a dividend. All of that money is being reinvested in building 14 gigawatts of renewable and storage. And as that is built, then shutting down the thermal activity. So it's going where the emissions are. It's taking that exposure to the emissions, but with a plan in order to do it. And in answer to your question, is it the private sector and government? It's both. And what is critical, and I'll credit Mark Tucker here, they're standing up and they're doing this, is that the banks, the investors, and others can take exposure to those emissions. In fact, one of the best strategies for the planet is for your emissions in your portfolio to go up because you've run towards the problem and then you're helping to get them down. And what's needed for that is to have some guardrails around and transparency about what you're actually doing. And last point, if I may, it's particularly critical in the emerging and developing world because the pathways, I mean, let's take India. Emissions in India. India is doing a phenomenal job with the transition and it's accelerating. But because of the growth and the surge of the middle class, of course, emissions are going to go up in India for a period. So the pathway in India is very different than what the pathway has to be in Canada. But we want international investors, and this is what GFANZ is working to do, to have greater and greater exposure to India to make sure that that trajectory happens. And that's why you need something called transition finance. Those definitions have been agreed. They're being developed. In fact, HSBC co-led the development of that. So the answer is yes. And I'm glad we're talking about it explicitly because this is the heart of the issue.
This is the heart of the issue. And we at the Council have worked with Chandra, and the way that he describes it, which I think is really important, is it's not our emissions today. It's not Tata Steel or BP's emissions today. It's what is their direction and what is their velocity and toward change. And how do they compare to others in the sector? And how does the ultimate output of their product actually impact society? So I think that this combination needs to be incorporated in what both government and private financiers say. And before I turn to you, Verena, Narendran, is there something that you want to say on this topic?
Yeah.
How you want to work with your private investors?
Absolutely. So I think to echo what Bernard said about fossil fuels, in some sense, steel is the most commonly used metal in the world. 30 times more steel is used than the next most commonly used metal. So you can't do without it, right? And for the transition as well, you need steel, whether to hold the solar panels up or for the windmills or for storage, for pipelines, you need steel. So you need to find a solution. And I think there's no silver bullet. There are a bouquet of solutions, which includes hydrogen, which includes carbon capture and usage, carbon capture and storage, everything, because it's $1 trillion industry. And India alone is going to add about 150 million tons of steel capacity every decade for the next few decades. And we have not even started talking about Africa, which is going to have another 3 billion people being added during the century. So I think you will have these hard-to-abate sectors growing. Cement production is twice the amount of steel production globally. So you will have these hard-to-abate sectors growing. So you need to find solutions which are technical, which don't get solved by just finding another energy source. You need to use different materials. You need to more efficiently use steel and cement. And hence the transition is a multi-decadal kind of transition which needs to happen. Infrastructure needs to be built for that as well.
Perhaps you want to share your experience in the Netherlands with your